You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 2, Curse of Midas. Part 1, The Strange Discovery. The sun began its slow climb over the distant horizon, turning the Wyoming sky a curious blend of lavender and amber. This gentle awakening had long been one of Duke Haynes's secret pleasures. Stepping outside before the rest of the world had fully rubbed the sleep from its eyes. Today, even as a chill rested in the air and the last remnants of moonlight threaded between the stalks of wheat, he felt that familiar surge of belonging. He had grown accustomed to the land's whispers, the way the wind teased the crops into swaying dances, how the old red barn creaked in response to gentle breezes, and the subtle crunch of the gravel road that stretched off into nowhere, yet connected him to everything he held dear. Duke stood at the edge of his property, his boots damp with dew that clung stubbornly to the fields. He inhaled deeply, the scent of soil and straw swirling in his lungs. There was a stillness here, a kind of calm that few ever truly experienced. It reminded him of the quiet moments he used to share with his grandfather, who'd once worked this very farm with hands as sure as Duke's were now. Turning, he cast a long glance over his shoulder. His home, a modest farmhouse painted in peeling white, sat cradled beneath a sky that promised a perfect, ordinary day. Through a window, he could just make out the silhouette of Samantha, his wife, moving about in the kitchen, likely preparing breakfast or setting Julie's school bag by the door. Samantha was a practical woman, her warmth never showy but always present like a steady flame. Her laughter could settle even the most restless moments, and he adored her for that. A movement near the fence line drew his attention. It wasn't unusual for small critters to slip in at dawn, searching for morsels or safe shelter. But this movement felt different, as if the brush itself was stirring, whispering secrets of something unexpected. Duke narrowed his eyes, heartbeats slowing. He took a step forward, drawn by a peculiar rustling sound that stood out against the usual hush. The morning chorus of sparrows and distant lowing of cattle tapered off, as if nature too paused in curiosity. As he edged closer, a form began to emerge from the weeds tangled near the barbed wire fence that marked the far boundary of his land. At first, Duke thought it might be a fox ensnared by some old stray wire, or perhaps a neighbor's cat caught in brambles. But as he reached the spot, pushing aside the stiff stalks with careful patience, he realized he was looking at something not quite one nor the other. The creature's fur was the color of autumn leaves, deep rust, and cinnamon hues that gleamed under the rising sun. It had the lithe body and pointed ears of a fox, but its face was softer, rounded, and whiskered like a cat's. Its eyes, large and shining like polished marbles, pleaded silently, reflecting Duke's own puzzled expression. It was trapped, caught in a snarl of old weeds and twine that clung to its collar. And there was indeed a collar, worn leather, slightly frayed at the edges, carrying a small brass tag. This was no wild creature. Someone loved this strange being, enough to give it a name and a home. Duke crouched down, moving slowly so as not to spook it further. He could sense fear radiating in quivers along the creature's flank. Its chest rose and fell in fast, nervous puffs. The morning's hush was so profound that Duke could almost hear the creature's heartbeat. With hands that had milked cows and guided tractors but also soothed a crying child and patted overworked shoulders, Duke reached forward. He spoke softly, his voice a low murmur that might calm it. "Easy there," he said, letting the words trail off into the morning. The creature twitched its ears in his direction. Its eyes, uncertain but curious, locked onto him. Duke smiled gently, the corners of his mouth easing into lines shaped by years of honest labor and quiet pride. He took hold of a sturdy stalk of weed and pulled it aside, careful not to tug abruptly. When the creature tried to scramble away, Duke placed a hand on the ground, palm down, showing he meant no harm. He remembered how he'd coaxed frightened calves or cornered barn cats, patience, softness in his tone, and an absence of sudden movements. In the near distance, the old red barn reflected the sun's first true beams, and he knew Samantha might look out any second, wondering what he was up to. Julie, their teenage daughter, would be dressing for school, maybe fretting over a chemistry quiz or what to wear to a weekend dance. He could picture Julie's mischievous grin and the way her eyes brightened when he recounted funny stories. Her curiosity mirrored his own. She would be thrilled to see something so unusual, so magical even, on their farm. Julie's voice would be full of questions. Where did it come from? Can we keep it? He could imagine how Samantha would lift an eyebrow in mild disbelief. Duke set to work freeing the creature. Bit by bit, he unraveled the weeds. The animal hissed softly, a sound neither cat-like nor fox-like, something altogether unique. Its fur brushed Duke's knuckles, soft and warm. There were no wounds visible, just the panic of entrapment. He found the last strand of weed wrapped around the collar's metal buckle. Gently, he loosened it. As the final loop fell away, the creature sprang backward, free at last. Duke leaned back on his heels, balancing himself in the uneven soil. It regarded him with a guarded expression, tail swishing low, ears flicking. They studied each other, man and creature, in the quiet golden morning. A cloud of dust drifted across the gravel road, stirred by a distant truck that passed unseen. Taking a careful step toward the fence, the creature shook out its fur and settled onto its haunches. It looked almost domesticated now, calmer, as if it understood what Duke had done. That was when Duke remembered the tag. If there was an address, someone, somewhere, was worrying. He inched closer, extending a hand not to grab it, but to show he meant no harm. The creature raised its chin just enough for Duke to glimpse the tag's inscription, an address etched in careful script, not too far off, maybe a few miles down the country roads he rarely ventured. He recognized some of those back roads from memory. He'd driven them years ago when delivering hay to a neighbor who'd since moved away. The address would be easy enough to find. Duke stood up, brushing dust from his jeans. His bones felt the morning's chill, but he was satisfied. He'd done a small kindness, and that set the day off right. He imagined returning the creature to its rightful owner, a stranger who lived quietly in the rural expanse beyond his farm. Perhaps it belonged to an eccentric hermit, or a family with kids who adored this strange pet. Whoever it was, they must be worried sick. Duke turned toward the farmhouse, its outline shimmering now under the strengthening light. Inside, Samantha would be humming absently as she stirred oatmeal, while Julie might be flipping through a magazine or finishing math homework at the kitchen table. He would have quite the story to tell them. Before heading back, he glanced once more at the creature. It was still there, watching, as though unsure whether to follow or flee. Duke gave a little nod, almost a bow of respect, and walked away. He did not want to pressure it into coming closer, nor did he want to leave it stranded. But the animal seemed fine now, just lost. And with the address in mind, Duke felt certain he could help reunite it with its owner. He imagined Julie's gasp of delight when he told her. She was at that age where the extraordinary seized her heart, where anything beyond the ordinary fed a sense of endless possibility. He saw her smile in his mind, that bright smile that made him feel like he'd done at least one thing right in this life. Samantha spotted him first when he stepped onto the porch. He saw her through the door's window, a quizzical tilt of her head, one eyebrow arched. They'd been married long enough that whole conversations flowed silently between them. She opened the door before he even reached for it. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and toast. Julie, perched at the table, was reviewing flashcards, her ponytail bobbing as she mouthed words silently. "You're back earlier than I expected," Samantha said, voice low, not wanting to disturb Julie's concentration. Duke nodded, leaning in to give her a quick, appreciative peck on the cheek. "Found something strange out by the fence line," he said, tone soft but excited. He told them about the creature, its odd combination of features, the state of its collar, and that carefully engraved address. Samantha's eyes widened slightly, the lines around them creasing. She was concerned, yes, but also intrigued. Julie set her flashcards down immediately. "Wait, a catfox thing?" Julie asked, her words spilling out. "Like some kind of wild hybrid?" Duke chuckled. "More or less. Never seen anything like it." He poured himself a mug of coffee, careful not to spill a drop. He wanted to savor this moment, the quiet marvel in the kitchen that was so often filled with the familiar routine. Coffee, eggs, hasty breakfast before school, and chores. Today, something new had brushed their lives. "I'm thinking I'll return it," Duke went on. "The tag has an address. Looks like it's just a few miles past old Miller's Creek. Maybe where that old trail leads off the main road. Samantha leaned against the counter, arms folded. Her practical nature surfaced. Be careful out there. That road's not well traveled. There's been talk of folks living off the grid. Just make sure you aren't walking into trouble. Duke smiled softly, understanding her protectiveness. I'll drive the truck. Shouldn't take long. I'll be back before lunch. Julie's face lit up. Can I come? She asked, half standing as if eager to bolt out the door. Samantha shook her head gently. School day, remember? You have that quiz you were studying for. Julie's shoulders slumped, but she didn't complain. She knew her mother was right. Responsibility first, then adventure. She glanced at her father, silently begging for details when he got back. Duke nodded, acknowledging her curiosity. He'd tell her everything, the layout of the land, the person he met, and what kind of home would suit such a mysterious creature. As Samantha turned back to the stove, flipping a couple of pancakes that sizzled in the pan, Duke drained his coffee. He could feel the energy humming through him. He was not an impulsive man by nature. He liked his routines and his quiet life. Yet the thought of this unexpected errand filled him with a gentle excitement. He remembered another time he'd done a kindness for a stranger, stopping by the roadside to help a stranded driver fix a flat tire in the middle of a snowstorm. The stranger had wept with gratitude. Small actions could ripple outward in ways one never fully understood. Perhaps returning this unusual pet would do more than ease someone's worry. It might forge a new connection, open a door to something unforeseen. After breakfast, Duke made sure to complete his morning chores, milking the remaining cow, checking on the chickens, ensuring the irrigation lines were functioning properly. The creature had disappeared into the brush near the fence line by now, presumably heading back toward its home or waiting in the shadows for his eventual arrival. He imagined it ghosting through the tall grass, ears perked, tail flicking, perhaps sensing that help was on the way. When he finally climbed into his old pickup truck, the seat's worn fabric greeted him with familiar comfort. The engine rumbled to life with a reassuring growl. From the porch, Samantha stood with her arms crossed lightly over her chest. Her eyes met his, and he could see a blend of trust and apprehension there. He gave her a small wave, and she nodded. Julie pressed her face to the screen door, mouthing the word, "Bye." And he smiled, remembering how, at her age, he had always been thirsty for a world bigger than what he knew. Now he understood the gift of an ordinary life, but he did not begrudge Julie her curiosity. As he pulled onto the gravel road, the wheels kicked up a cloud of dust that drifted lazily into the morning light. The farm receded behind him, fields rolling away into a patchwork of green and gold. A hawk circled overhead, its cry distant and sharp. The land's quiet songs continued, guiding him forward. Each mile he drove gave him more time to think. Who was this TITUS? He would soon learn the owner's name. Who kept such a creature for a pet? Why this collar and that exact address? He imagined a reclusive man with kind eyes, maybe a family that had lost something precious and never expected to get it back. His pickup navigated the winding back roads, past leaning fence posts and abandoned grain silos that stood as monuments to a past era. Soon, he would reach an area less familiar, beyond where he usually traded goods with neighbors. The day had only just begun, and the possibilities hovered in the quiet air. Back at home, Samantha and Julie would go about their day, secure in routine, yet aware that Duke was out here doing something unusual. The thought comforted him, gave him purpose. He recalled the creature's eyes, large and searching. There had been no malice there, only fear and confusion. Setting it free was a small kindness, and now this journey to return it felt like a moral obligation. He knew somehow that these events were threads of a larger tapestry being woven. Though he could not yet see the grand design, he sensed that his family's life would soon change in ways both magnificent and terrifying. And that one day when all was said and done, when curses were broken and understanding restored, they might look back on this quiet morning and realize it was the hinge upon which everything turned. Duke gripped the wheel, knuckles flexing with resolve. If he was honest with himself, he felt a tiny thrill, a boyish excitement at doing something unexpected. He was not just a farmer returning a lost pet. He was setting the stage for something greater. The wind teased the open window, ruffling his hair. He took a calming breath, grounding himself. Soon, he would arrive. Soon, he would meet TITUS. a large man with a grateful heart, and something stranger than magic, brewing beneath that gentle smile. Soon, he would speak words in jest that would become a curse. But not yet. For now, he was simply a man on a mission of kindness, following the slender thread of fate that began with finding a cat-fox hybrid in the weeds at the edge of his land. He'd tell Samantha every detail when he got back. He knew she'd worry if he tarried too long. He described the landscape, the homestead he discovered, and the moment he handed back the creature. He'd watch Julie's eyes widen as he recounted the animal's vibrant fur and cautious gaze. They would share a meal that day, just as they always did, never guessing that by the following morning's light, their world would take on a strange new shimmer. But the seeds of change had already been planted in this quiet part of Wyoming, amidst fields of wheat and a well-worn red barn. Duke Haynes would see it through, for he was a man who kept his word, who trusted the land and its quiet miracles, and who believed that returning what was lost was always the right thing to do. With these thoughts twining in his mind, Duke pressed onward, the early light bathing the dusty road ahead, each moment unfurling as if guided by an unseen hand. Part 2. Journey into the Unknown. Duke guided his old truck past the last familiar landmark, a bent signpost half swallowed by summer weeds, and ventured deeper along a path he'd never cared to follow until this morning's strange discovery. The crunch of gravel under his tires gave way to the quiet whisper of packed earth. Dust rose in a fine veil behind him, settling over his rear windshield like a secret only the landscape could keep. He'd promised Samantha he'd be careful, and the thought of her watchful gaze, even from miles away, pressed him to stay alert. He checked the rearview mirror, saw nothing but pale dust and distant wheat fields shrinking into memory. Ahead, a different world emerged. The roadside transformed from neat farmland into something less tended. Fence posts leaned drunkenly at odd angles, as if too tired to uphold their duty. The grasses grew taller here, rougher, swaying in a subtle, irregular tempo. Here and there, he spotted a lone pine rising out of the earth like a watchman. The occasional cluster of broad-leafed plants he didn't recognize cluttered the edges of the track. As the sun climbed higher, those plants caught the light on their leaves, reflecting a muted greenish shimmer, while the tall grasses beneath them bent in complex patterns. Something about this land felt older and more private, as though it bore witness to whispers humans rarely heard. Duke slowed the truck, squinting at the barely legible county map he'd brought along. A pencil line had been scribbled in the margin, his best guess from recalling a conversation with an old neighbor many years ago. He nudged the map aside and glanced at the creature curled on the passenger seat. He'd coaxed it into the truck with a gentle murmur and a soft toss of a half-empty sack once used for chicken feed. It wasn't caged. He didn't have a cage anyway. And yet it settled there calmly, tail wrapped around its body. Duke could sense the animal's tension had eased since being freed from the weeds. He dared a quiet whisper. "We almost there?" The creature blinked, unblinking silence its only reply. Whether it understood him or not, Duke couldn't say, but it eyed him with an intelligence that made his spine tingle. He passed a crooked sign reading something he could hardly decipher. Most of the letters had faded. The world beyond that sign belonged to a different order, more governed by nature's quiet negotiations than the schedules and routines he knew. The road dipped into a valley he'd never realized existed, a stretch of lowland shadowed by hillocks and fringed by pines leaning toward one another, as if passing secrets from root to root. He noticed how the sunlight here felt thinner, more diffused, as if strained through layers of dust and memory. He breathed in, a scent of damp earth, distant water, and the faint tang of wood smoke. There might be a creek nearby. He recalled TITUS's property mentioned a creek in the old county records he'd skimmed. He hoped he wasn't lost. Samantha would shake her head if he returned late. Julie, back at the farm, would ask endless questions. He smiled, imagining her bright curiosity. He would have a story worth telling, that was certain. As the truck navigated a bend around a stand of pines, Duke spotted something unexpected. Through gaps in foliage, he saw a cabin, small, time-worn, its wooden planks bleached by too many winters. A few chickens scattered in the brush, clucking softly. A fence of mismatched boards traced a ragged line around the property. Beyond it, a thin creek shimmered, cutting a gentle path through the yard. The cabin's porch sagged in the middle, and a single window reflected a shard of sun that winked in his direction. Duke's heart fluttered. This must be it. He slowed to a stop at the edge of the property, where the fence was partially broken. The track here ended as if it had grown bored of going farther. He killed the engine, and silence closed in, save for the faint burble of the creek and the distant cry of a lone bird overhead. The creature on the seat lifted its head. The fur around its ears twitched, as if it recognized a familiar scent. Duke unlatched his door and stepped out, boots pressing into soil so soft it almost sighed under his weight. He looked around. The air felt different, heavier but not ominous. More like an old place that had learned patience. If the Haynes farm was well-ordered and friendly, this place had a quiet reticence, a distant politeness that waited to judge him on his actions, not his words. Duke walked along the fence line, searching for a gate. He found one at last. Though it leaned so far off its hinges, he wasn't sure it qualified as a gate anymore. He glanced at the cabin door, and just as he did, a figure emerged from behind the structure. The man was large, tall and broad as a barn door, with shoulders that strained the seams of his faded flannel shirt. His hair was a storm cloud of unruly curls, streaked with silver. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step betraying a kind of weariness. His eyes flicked to the truck, then to Duke, narrowing, then easing, as if sorting strangers from threats. Duke noticed the lines etched into the man's face, evidence of countless days under open skies, countless nights staring at embers in a fire pit. A man acquainted with loneliness, perhaps. "Hello?" Duke called, raising his hand in a gesture of peace. He tried to find the right words. I think I have something that belongs to you." The large man approached, stopping a few paces away, eyeing Duke with quiet intensity. This close, Duke could see worry etched around his eyes, the way his shoulders held tension, as if braced for bad news. Duke headed back to his truck, gingerly reaching inside for the creature. He half expected it to shy away, but it stood elegantly, balancing lightly on the seat. When Duke offered his arm, the animal stepped onto it and up against his chest, clinging gently to the fabric of his jacket. Duke marveled again at how strange and lovely it was, and how it trusted him now. He carried it toward the man, holding it as one might hold a friend's lost kitten. As soon as they drew near, the creature sprang free, leaping into the man's thick arms. The man caught it awkwardly, but securely. For a heartbeat, Duke feared the creature might have been timid here too. Instead, a wash of relief passed over the man's face. He closed his eyes and pressed his cheek against its fur. The creature purred, a low rumbling note that was neither cat's nor fox's, but some new sound blending gratitude and comfort. The man's posture softened as if a great weight had lifted. "Thank you," the man said softly, voice deep and resonant. A dryness clung to his words, as if he seldom spoke aloud. His eyes shone suddenly with tears he did not attempt to hide. "I've been searching since dawn, afraid I'd never see this one again." Duke shrugged modestly, his heart warming. "Just found it tangled up near my fence. Figured I'd return it." He offered a small smile. He'd never been one to crave praise. The man nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm Titus," he said, cradling the creature more securely now. "This is Winna." He nodded down at his unusual companion, who blinked slowly, regarding Duke as though acknowledging the completion of some noble errand. I didn't expect a stranger to go out of their way like this. It's not something you see often." Duke shrugged again, feeling a warmth in his chest. "We try to help when we can," he said simply. "Name's Duke. Duke Haynes. Got a farm a few miles over." At the mention of the farm, an image of Samantha and Julie flashed through his mind. He hoped they'd be pleased to know everything went smoothly. Titus's gaze flickered, examining Duke for honesty, finding it readily. "Your kindness? I don't know how to repay it," Titus began, voice thick. "Anything I have is yours to wish for." He said it with a fervor that made Duke uncomfortable. He wasn't used to grand gestures. They made him feel as though he might break something delicate by accident. Duke scratched the back of his neck, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He noticed how the wind had quieted, as if listening closely. "Not necessary," Duke replied. I'm just glad to help. He offered a conciliatory grin. I should be heading back soon. My wife and daughter. But Titus wouldn't have it. His eyes brightened with a peculiar intensity. No, please, he insisted, stepping closer. Winna tucked securely under one arm. A good deed deserves a reward. It must. Ask for anything. Truly. I mean anything. Duke let out a short laugh, half hoping to diffuse the seriousness. I appreciate the offer, but I'm all set. Really. He thought of Samantha's easy smile, of Julie's curious eyes. He had everything he needed. Love, a home, honest work. I just did what anyone would. Titus did not smile. Instead, he searched Duke's face, as though reading lines drawn there by fate itself. Not everyone would, he said softly, shaking his head. You don't understand what you've done. Bringing Winna home. It matters. More than you know. His voice trembled with sincerity. Duke felt himself becoming uneasy. What was this? Some kind of local custom? A test? He tried to gently back away from the conversation. Look, I better get going. Titus raised a hand, not threateningly, but firmly. Please, he said. Ask for something, even if it's small. I can give you wealth, land, health, anything. You have saved my friend, and I cannot let that go unrewarded. Duke let out a half chuckle, shoulders relaxing a fraction. Maybe humor would free him. Anything, huh? He mused, glancing at the creek that glimmered under the sun, at the battered boards of the cabin, at Winna's calm yet watchful eyes. Well, if you're sure... He paused, thinking of something whimsical. Might as well turn this awkward moment into a bit of harmless fun. He certainly didn't believe in magic or whatnot, but he could indulge the man's gratitude. How about this? He said, trying to keep his tone light. I'd love it if everything I touch turned to gold. He gave a small snort at the absurdity. It was a line straight out of an old legend, something he vaguely recalled from a long-ago bedtime story. Titus's reaction was unexpected. His face, previously soft with relief and gratitude, grew still as carved stone. His eyes, bright moments before, now shone with a seriousness that made Duke's stomach tighten. The wind returned, stirring the grass and sighing against the fence posts. The sun seemed to dim, just slightly, as if uncertain about shining so brightly on this moment. You would have that? Titus asked, his voice almost formal. Winna's ears twitched, and the creature looked up at its owner, as if checking whether it had heard correctly. Duke swallowed, suddenly aware he'd stepped onto treacherous ground. He raised his hands, palms open, as if to prove innocence. I'm not serious, Duke said. I was just joking. What would I do with something like that? He tried to laugh again, but his voice came out too thin. Titus nodded slowly. I see, he said, and lowered his gaze to the creature in his arms. He stroked Winna's fur once, whispering something Duke couldn't quite catch. When he looked back up, Titus's expression was grave. I understand. But a wish, granted, cannot be withdrawn. You asked, even in jest. So it shall be. Duke's heart kicked at his ribs. He found himself stepping back, one hand lifting instinctively. Now wait a second, he said, trying to keep his voice firm. I wasn't... But Titus raised his free hand, palm outward, and Duke stopped mid-sentence. The air felt charged, as though a thunderhead hovered just beyond his vision. Come morning, Titus said, voice low and certain. Your touch shall turn all you hold into gold. It is done. His eyes softened, as if regretting something. Go home, Duke. Tomorrow you'll understand. Duke could find no reply that made sense. His mind churned with confusion and a touch of anger. Was this man mocking him? Some kind of elaborate prank? He thought of Samantha's warning to be careful. He thought of Julie's delight if he came back with a tall tale. Maybe this was just a strange local. He forced a polite nod, clearing his throat. Sure, Duke managed. He looked around for a hint of trickery. No camera, no neighbors lurking about. Only that creek, the old fence, the cabin leaning against the horizon. I'm heading out now. You take care of yourself. Glad Winna's back home. He tipped the brim of his hat, an old habit signaling good faith, and turned on his heel. As Duke marched back toward the truck, the grass whispered around his boots. He felt Titus's gaze on his back, but dared not look. The whole exchange rattled him, like stumbling over a root in familiar ground. He clambered into the driver's seat and started the engine. The pickup coughed into life, and he glanced at the passenger seat where the creature had perched before. Empty now, of course, and the seat's fabric dimpled where its weight had been. He exhaled, leaning over the wheel for a moment, collecting himself. When he finally looked back at the property, Titus stood exactly where he'd been, cradling Winna. The man did not wave, only watched. Duke backed the truck around, careful not to damage anything. Dust rose again as he pulled away, heading back the way he'd come. He managed a single glance in the rearview mirror and saw Titus's figure growing smaller until the cabin and the tall grasses consumed him. Duke tried to shake off the encounter's strange feeling. Perhaps Titus was just a lonely soul who believed in paying debts symbolically. Duke resolved to treat the exchange like a quirky anecdote. He'd tell Samantha that the owner was grateful and a bit odd. He'd tell Julie about Winna, leaving out the uneasy parts. That would be best. The afternoon sun was now higher, and Duke navigated the dusty back roads, following the landmarks he'd memorized. A leaning oak tree, a small bridge of rotting planks. Everything about the route back seemed normal, reassuring. As he climbed out of that secluded valley, the wind carried familiar scents. Distant hayfields, the faint musk of grazing cattle. He tried, as he drove, to dismiss the hint of dread nesting in his belly. The notion of a granted wish belonged in children's tales, not here. He was a farmer. He knew the feel of real soil under his nails. Nothing so impossible could brew out here. And yet, as he approached his farm, saw the distant lines of well-tended fences, the green and gold tapestry of wheat, and the silhouette of his family's barn, he couldn't entirely purge the memory of Titus's face. There had been a strange conviction in that man's voice, a calm finality that did not invite disbelief. Duke blew out a long breath, rolled his shoulders, and tried to think practically. It was midday now. Samantha would have lunch ready soon, and Julie might still be at school. He'd get home, wash up, and share the story. Perhaps tonight after chores, he'd lean back on the porch, watch the sunset dip behind the fields, and laugh at himself for getting so wound up. The truck rattled over a familiar rise, and there it was. His farmhouse, home. He slowed down. Tomorrow he'd see that nothing had changed. Tomorrow he'd wake up, touch something ordinary, and find it just as it was, solid and real. The idea that everything could turn to gold was ludicrous. Gold was heavy, lifeless. His world was anything but lifeless. He wanted the warm handshakes of neighbors, the smell of fresh bread, the coo of a satisfied hen, the scrape of a wooden spoon stirring oatmeal. None of that had room for a curse. He eased into his yard, rolled the truck to a stop, and let silence settle around him. Birds sang. The old porch steps creaked under a gentle breeze. Perfectly normal. As he opened the truck door, he realized he was still clenching the steering wheel tightly. He forced himself to relax. Stepping onto the porch, he heard Samantha call his name from inside. Her voice brought warmth rushing back into him, a wave of comfort and reality. He'd tell her about Titus, but keep it light. There was no need to so worry. He'd laugh it off as a piece of rural folklore, a man and his mysterious pet making impossible promises. Yes, everything would be fine. He reached for the handle of the screen door, determined to put the morning behind him. The metal felt reassuringly cool and ordinary beneath his palm. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. He pushed it open, stepping into the familiar glow of home. Samantha stood by the kitchen table, eyebrows raised expectantly, ready to hear what had transpired. He mustered a confident grin, the kind that said, "Don't worry, all is well." She smiled back, relieved to see him safe. The weight in his chest eased. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and when it did, this strange promise of gold would surely prove nothing more than empty words carried off by the Wyoming wind. For now, he was simply Duke Haynes, back on his own land, secure in his world, wanting nothing more than a quiet afternoon's work and the comforting company of those he loved. Part 3. The First Touches of Gold. Duke woke before the first flush of dawn, as he always did, drawn from sleep by a farmer's internal clock that never needed winding. Outside, the Wyoming sky wore a veil of gray-blue. Sunrise was a rumor waiting to happen. He rose quietly, not wishing to disturb Samantha or Julie, and stepped into his worn boots, still half expecting to feel yesterday's events slip through his memory like a dream. The odd man, TITUS, and his strange promise. Surely it was nonsense. Duke had gone to bed convinced that come morning, everything would be ordinary again. He slipped out the back door and into the hush of the yard. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp hay and distant pine. His first chore would be to check the fence line. A latch had been sticking lately, and he intended to fix it. He crouched by an old toolbox near the barn door. He'd left a metal fence tool there the previous evening. As he wrapped his calloused fingers around its handle, he expected the familiar heft of steel. Instead, an uncanny warmth pulsed through the tool, spreading into his palm. In the weak morning light, he saw the dull gray metal shifting before his very eyes, turning lustrous and bright. It happened fast and silent, like a strange alchemy. He pulled his hand back, heart kicking against his ribs. The fence tool, once ordinary, now gleamed. A perfect sculpture of gold. Duke blinked, mouth slightly open. He looked at his hand, rough skin, worn nails, the hand of a farmer, and then back at the tool. He set it carefully on the ground, nudging it with a boot to ensure it was real. It rang dully against a stone as he did, proving it wasn't some trick of the light. A wave of disbelief crashed over him. He remembered Titus's voice, solemn as a vow, promising that his wish would be granted come morning. Duke had laughed at the absurdity. Now his laughter died in his throat. For a moment, he thought, maybe I'm still asleep. Maybe this is some feverish dream. He reached for the shovel leaning against the barn wall. The instant his fingertips grazed the handle, the shovel shimmered, its wooden haft and steel head shifting as if molten, hardening into a single mass of gold. He let out a ragged breath. This was impossible, utterly impossible. Yet here it was, gleaming in the early light. He glanced toward the farmhouse where Samantha and Julie still slept. An urge to share this moment, to have someone confirm his sanity, made him hurry across the yard. He rushed toward the back steps, his boots stirring dust into the cool morning air. He tried to steady his shaking hands. At the door, he grabbed the knob. Immediately, it softened and then reformed, heavy and gold. He yelped, jerking his hand away. The door, partially ajar, now bore a golden handle. Could he open it without touching it again? "Sam?" he called, voice tight and low. He shoved his shoulder against the wood to push the door inward. Inside, the kitchen was warm from the old stove. Samantha stood by the sink with a cup of coffee, startled by his sudden entrance. Julie sat at the kitchen table flipping through a magazine, her eyes still heavy with sleep. Both turned toward him, alarmed by the strange sound in his voice. Duke stepped into the kitchen and felt the world tilt. He held out his hands, palms up, as if asking for mercy. "I need you both to see something," he said. His voice wavered. Samantha frowned, crossing the room, her brows knitting in concern. Julie set aside the magazine. "What's wrong?" Samantha's question hovered in the air. Duke pointed to the door behind him. "I touched it. The knob turned to gold." He stepped back, allowing them a clearer view. There it was, a glimmering golden knob, out of place against chipped white paint. Samantha's mouth fell open. Julie rose to her feet, chair scraping against the floorboards. "How?" Julie began, her voice strangled by disbelief. Before Duke could form a reply, he spotted Samantha's mug of coffee on the table. He was parched from shock and confusion, and without thinking, he reached for it. Perhaps he simply needed something familiar, something to anchor him. As his fingers curled around the ceramic mug, the sensation returned. Warmth, a ripple of otherworldly power. The mug, the coffee within, all of it crystallized into metal. He nearly dropped it, staring as steam no longer rose from its surface. The mug was now a golden cylinder, the coffee inside an amber-hued metal. He could see Samantha's and Julie's reflections twisted on its polished surface. Julie gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth. Samantha took a step forward, but Duke jerked away, holding the mug out like a cursed object. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. Alarm flared in Samantha's eyes. "Duke, what's happening?" she demanded, voice trembling. She tried to approach, but he raised a hand, palm outward. He dared not touch her, not even the hem of her sleeve. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. "I don't know," he managed. Yesterday, that man, Titus, he said, I asked for—" He couldn't bring himself to say it again, the ridiculous request that had spilled from his lips. Everything he touched turning to gold. He had thought it a joke. Now it chained him to a horrifying reality. Samantha, ever practical even under stress, tried to remain calm. "Duke, maybe we can figure this out," she said, her voice low and soothing. Julie stood at her mother's side, eyes wide, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Samantha wanted to comfort him, put a hand on his shoulder, but Duke stepped back so violently that his hip bumped the table. A salt shaker rattled, and he snatched at it instinctively. It, too, flashed into gold. He groaned, panic blazing through his veins. "Don't come near me," he choked, voice raw. His throat tightened as if a band had been drawn around it. "Samantha, Julie, I can't, if I touch you." He couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too grotesque. The very thought of turning his beloved family to cold metal stirred a sickness in his gut. Julie whimpered softly, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "Papa?" she said, using the old name she hadn't used since she was much younger. Samantha placed a protective arm around her shoulders, holding her back, tears shining in her own eyes. She was at a loss for words, and that frightened Duke more than anything. Samantha was never at a loss for words. Duke's stomach clenched with hunger and fear. He hadn't eaten yet. Perhaps food would calm him. His mind grasped for normal routines. Breakfast, a moment to think. He snatched a piece of toast from the plate on the table's edge. The instant his fingertip brushed the crust, the toast transformed. The buttery surface rippled with golden luster. He tried a slice of bacon, a trembling attempt. It too became a useless ornament. Now a panic of another sort gripped him. He could not eat or drink. He was trapped by his own touch, isolated from the necessities of life. His body shook. He was hungry, thirsty, and desperate. Samantha made a tiny, heartbroken sound. Her husband, strong and capable Duke, now looked like a man teetering on the edge of madness. Julie wept silently, tears making bright trails down her cheeks. Duke couldn't bear it. I have to go," he stammered. "I can't stay here. Everything I touch, you saw—" He stepped away, staggering toward the door, careful not to brush against their shoulders. Samantha started to protest, but he fixed her with a terrified gaze. "Stay back, please," he begged. "I won't risk you. I have to think. I have to—" He didn't know what he had to do, but he knew staying in this house put them in danger. He couldn't trust himself not to reach for Samantha's comforting hand, or ruffle Julie's hair as he once did to calm her worries. He blundered out the back door, his boots scraping the threshold. Outside, the air stung with sudden brightness. Birds chattered in the barn rafters, oblivious to the drama unfolding below. Duke stumbled toward the barn, breath coming in sharp bursts. His farm dog darted out from behind a hay bale, tail wagging. Before the animal could run to greet him, Duke shouted, voice cracking, "No!" He waved his arms frantically, sending the dog skittering backward in confusion. He had nearly forgotten about the animals. What if he touched one of the cows, or the hens? The thought of gold statues littering his barnyard sickened him. He must keep clear of all living things. The barn's shadow fell across him as he slipped inside. Dust motes swirled in diagonal sunbeams. He stood in the center of the aisle, lined with stalls on either side. This place, once so comforting, now felt like a prison, Or maybe a tomb in waiting. He needed somewhere to hide from his own hands. That's what he was now, a walking curse. The old stall at the far end, usually reserved for storage, had no animals. He made his way there, heart still hammering. He entered the empty stall and pressed his back against the rough wooden boards. Immediately, the boards sparked with that unsettling transformation, turning to a panel of gold. He winced and stepped away, careful not to touch too large a surface. If he turned the barn entirely into gold, it would be useless, too heavy and dead to serve its purpose. He stood in the center of the stall, arms raised slightly, as if trying to avoid brushing against invisible tripwires. His stomach growled angrily. Hunger gnawed at him. But what could he do? He thought of dipping his hand into a feed bucket. No, that would turn to gold too. Even water from the trough would harden to a metal block at his touch. He could drink nothing, eat nothing. Fear escalated, hot and urgent. How could he survive more than a day? He thought of Samantha and Julie. They must be terrified. He wanted to reassure them, but how? Shouting from the barn might draw them near. They would want to comfort him. Samantha would offer solutions. Julie would brainstorm with the creativity of youth. But if they came close, what if, in a moment of weakness, he reached out? He would destroy them. He imagined Julie's gentle features locked in lifeless gold. Samantha's kind eyes turned hollow. A sob ripped from his throat. He pressed his fist to his forehead, careful not to touch his face, lest he discover if this curse worked on himself. Did it? He dared not try. He lowered himself slowly, carefully, onto a hay bale in the corner. His boots brushed some straw, and it too became golden threads. He watched, horrified, as the transformation spread from the point of contact, leaving him perched atop a bale-shaped ingot. Even the scent changed. No warm, earthy smell of hay remained, only the cool odorlessness of metal. He closed his eyes, struggling to steady his breathing. He had to think of a way out. The memory of Titus surfaced, vivid and urgent. That man had promised this. No, not promised, declared it. He had taken Duke's jesting request and made it real. Duke hadn't believed it, hadn't considered the consequences. Now he understood the gravity of his words. He must find Titus again. But how? He couldn't drive. Touching the steering wheel would turn it to gold. Even if he tried to drive a golden truck, would it even run? It would be heavy and inert, its moving parts fused into useless metal. He couldn't hitch the horses. They'd turn to gold. He couldn't ride a bicycle, hold a map, or call for help. Phones and wires, all would stiffen into gleaming sculptures. The barn door creaked. Duke's eyes snapped open. For a moment, panic clawed at his throat. He waited, listening intently. A faint shuffle of footsteps outside the stall. Samantha's voice calling softly. "Duke?" It was trembling, barely above a whisper. He could imagine her pressing her ear to the barn wall, heart pounding. He forced himself to remain still, not daring to move closer. "Samantha," he called, voice rough. "Stay back. Don't come in." He heard her choke back a sob. It tore at him, but he steeled himself. I'm all right," he lied. "I just need time to think. Don't risk it." He heard her breathing through the wooden slats. He pictured her leaning there, face streaked with tears, wanting nothing more than to take him in her arms. Julie might be standing behind her, peeking around the barn door, terrified and helpless. The thought of their anguish twisted his insides. He wanted to comfort them, to say, "We'll fix this." But he had no plan, no confidence. All he had was desperation and guilt. When Samantha replied, her voice wavered like a delicate string under too much tension. "Duke, we'll find a way. Maybe gloves? Some protective covering?" Duke closed his eyes, considering it. Gloves. If he put gloves on, would they turn to gold before he could even slip them on properly? Everything he touched immediately transformed. The moment his skin contacted them, the gloves would lose all flexibility, becoming rigid gold shells. Impossible. Still, she was trying. He loved her for that. He didn't want to crush her hope. "Maybe," he said softly. "I'll think on it." He hoped this meager concession might keep despair from consuming them all. He listened as Samantha's footsteps retreated. The barn felt hollow in her absence. Outside, the day pressed on. Crows scolded something unseen, a breeze sighed through the grass. Life continued, indifferent to his plight. He paced the stall carefully, each footstep turning bits of straw into gilded fragments. He dared not reach out to the walls again. The more he touched, the more trapped he would become, encased in a golden prison of his own making. Time crawled, measured by the pounding of his pulse in his ears. He tried to think strategically. He needed to survive. If he couldn't eat or drink by touching things directly, what if he poured water into his mouth without touching it? But how would he lift a cup? A cup would become gold, losing any fluid it contained. Could he lap water like an animal from a stream without touching it? Even if he dipped his tongue, would that turn the water in his mouth to gold? The curse likely encompassed all contact, not just his hands. He could accidentally transform his own tongue or teeth. The thought made him shudder. He remembered Titus's solemn face, the creek behind the man's cabin, the odd creature he had rescued. There had to be a reason Titus had done this. Magic or no magic, Titus had understood the consequences. Maybe Titus expected Duke to return and beg for mercy. But how could Duke get there? Exhaustion tugged at him. He leaned against the stall's corner, resting his head without touching anything but the back of his shirt to the boards. Hunger gnawed at his belly, thirst scorched his throat. His mind wandered through memories. Yesterday's chores now felt like distant luxuries, drinking from a water jug without fear, hugging Julie goodnight, Samantha's hand on his shoulder, comforting him with just a touch. Had he taken all these simple acts for granted? Of course he had. One does not value air until gasping for breath. A faint clatter outside reminded him he was not alone. Samantha might be trying to devise something, tools that could feed him, contraptions to help him drink. Julie, resourceful and clever, might try to talk him through the door, asking questions to find some loophole. He prayed they wouldn't risk entering. The fear of harming them weighed on him like a stone around his neck. The day wore on. Light shifted, slanting differently through the cracks in the barn walls. The gold surfaces he'd created caught the sun and threw back strange reflections. He moved as little as possible, terrified of changing more of his world into this cold perfection. Outside, he occasionally heard Samantha's voice, muffled. She might have been talking to the neighbor by phone, or perhaps searching for old maps to find Titus's homestead. She was not the type to give up easily. Duke's head ached from thirst. He closed his eyes, imagining cool water trickling down his throat, a simple slice of bread in his hand. He would have given all the gold in the world for a single bite of food. He almost laughed at the cruel irony. He had desired a golden touch, and now he was drowning in it, starving in it. He would have cried, but tears seemed dried up by shock and fear. As the afternoon stretched long, he thought again of that strange pet, Winna, and the look in Titus's eyes. Something about that animal and its master felt ancient, as if they belonged to old stories that parents told their children to warn them about careless wishes. He must find a way back there. He must beg for release from this curse. But first, he had to survive. He had to keep Samantha and Julie safe. He would not call them closer. Better they stay in the house or yard, brainstorming. If one of them accidentally brushed against him, he'd never forgive himself. A whisper of determination sparked within him. He would endure. He would find a way. He would not let this curse destroy him or his family. He owed them that much. He stared at his hands, still fleshy and warm, so deceptively normal. Those hands that had once lifted bales of hay, embraced loved ones, carved initials into a barn beam in a moment of whimsy. Now they were tools of devastation. He would not let them have their way. The barn fell quiet as dusk approached. Long shadows claimed the corners. Outside, an owl called, and distant coyotes yipped at the edge of the wilderness. Duke knew Samantha and Julie would not sleep easy tonight. Neither would he. He would wait until morning, and then somehow he would find a solution. If he had to journey on foot, never touching anything but the ground beneath his boots, he would do it. If he had to signal to a passing stranger for help, though that carried its own risks, he would try. Anything to reverse this madness. He curled into himself, trying to conserve warmth and strength. The golden surfaces he'd created reflected the dimming light, making the stall glow eerily. He had become a bringer of unnatural splendor. Wherever he went, he left a path of gleaming ruin. He hated the sight of it. He would do anything to return to the world of simple wood and worn iron, the humble materials of a working farm. Night settled. He listened to the rustle of straw turned gold under his boots as he shifted, to the faint hum of crickets outside, to the slow rhythm of his own breathing. He might have dozed off at intervals, never fully resting. His mind drifted to Samantha's voice, steady, practical, full of love. To Julie's laughter, young, hopeful. He would protect them, even if that meant never touching them again until the curse was broken. This was only the beginning of a terrible test. He would face hunger, thirst, isolation, and despair. But Duke Haynes was not a man to break easily. He clung to hope as a drowning man clings to a raft. He would find a way to undo his careless wish. He would return to his family whole and safe. For now, though, he remained in that stall, avoiding even the gentlest contact with the world around him, surrounded by cold, gleaming monuments to a folly he never intended. Part 4. Life as a Living Curse. The morning after the barn incident found Duke still hunched in that empty stall, arms folded close to his chest as though he could keep his touch sealed away from the world. The first pale light seeped through the cracks, illuminating the bizarre transformation he'd wrought. A hay bale of gold, some boards sporting gilded patches, and scattered bits of straw stiffened into metal filaments. He would have laughed at the absurdity if he weren't trembling with hunger, thirst, and the ache of isolation. He had not slept well. How could he have? Every time his body shifted, he risked another flare of that dreadful magic. Still, the need to see Samantha and Julie tugged at him like a chain. At least he could look at them from a safe distance. That was something. He stood, careful to avoid touching the walls. His limbs felt hollow, drained. He was weak, and the morning's chill prickled his skin. Outside, he heard footsteps approach, light, hesitant steps. Julie's voice drifted in, quiet but hopeful. "Dad?" she called, standing just past the barn doors. "We brought you some things." He imagined her face, brave and determined, trying not to cry. He moved toward the stall's doorway and peered out. There they were, Samantha and Julie, standing a good distance away. Samantha carried a small bundle clutched in her arms. They had laid blankets on the ground between them and the stall, as if it were a makeshift neutral zone. On it lay a pair of thick rubber gloves, a long wooden ladle, and a handful of dried fruit set on a tin plate. Duke swallowed hard. He understood what they were attempting. Solutions. They were brainstorming ways for him to eat and drink without turning everything to gold. He wanted to cry with gratitude and shame. Shame because he'd put them in this situation. Gratitude because they were fighting for him. "I'm here," he said softly, voice rasping from thirst. "Thank you." Samantha's posture straightened at the sound of his voice, and she mustered a reassuring smile. She tried to sound confident. We thought maybe if you put on these gloves." She didn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Gloves would shield his touch. Duke nodded, though his heart doubted it would work. The transformation spread instantly through everything he touched, no matter how carefully. Still, he had to try. He stepped gingerly from the stall, avoiding contact with anything. He moved as if he were walking through a field of invisible tripwires. Reaching the blanket, he lowered himself, balancing carefully, and nudged the gloves with one fingertip. The moment he touched them, he had half hoped they might remain soft and pliable. The material stiffened, hardening into golden shells. He drew back with a frustrated sigh. Samantha winced as if struck. Julie folded her arms across her stomach, trying not to let tears escape. So much for that idea. "Maybe something else," Julie said, voice trembling. We can try leather. Or something else thicker." Duke raised a hand to stop her. He didn't want them throwing more materials into the fire of his curse. He couldn't stand seeing their hope dashed again and again. "I appreciate it," he said quietly, "but it's not working." His voice carried a defeated tone that stung his own ears. He bent forward, examining the ladle. Wood would fare no better than rubber. But desperate, he tried anyway, tapping its handle. Instantly, gold. The ladle's shape remained, but it was a sculpture now, useless for scooping water. He closed his eyes, jaw tightening. Hunger roiled in his stomach, and his throat felt like sandpaper. Even if Samantha poured water into his mouth from a distance, would the moment it touched him turn the water to gold? His curse seemed absolute. With a shaky breath, Duke looked up. "You should keep your distance," he said to them. "I don't want to risk—" He couldn't bring himself to finish that sentence, not in front of Julie. He would never forgive himself if he harmed them. Samantha and Julie lingered a moment longer, as if searching for some last-minute miracle. Samantha's eyes flicked to a bucket of water near the barn door. What if I pour the water into something else first? But she didn't even finish the thought. They both knew it would fail the same way. Every resourceful idea they conjured would shatter into a golden statue of itself. Julie cleared her throat. "Dad, I can read you the news." She pulled a folded newspaper from her back pocket, holding it up, voice trembling yet resolute. "You know, like we used to do when the day was slow?" Her eyes pleaded with him. "Let me help, at least by distraction." Duke managed a faint nod. The kindness behind her offer lit a small candle in his darkened mind. Samantha gave Julie's shoulder a gentle squeeze and stepped back. They must have guessed he wanted their company, even from afar. Julie's voice began to read headlines about local fairs, weather patterns, and community announcements. Normally, Duke would have snorted at the mundane nature of it all, but now her voice was a tether, pulling him back from the brink of despair. He listened, forcing himself to focus on the words. He tried to forget the dryness in his throat, the gnawing emptiness in his belly. As Julie read, Samantha stood beside her, occasionally adding a quip or a small joke, desperate attempts to bring a grin to his face. He smiled faintly once or twice, though it felt strange and hollow, as if his face had forgotten how to move naturally. Duke realized that even these small comforts were precarious. He was dangerous now, a walking curse. He couldn't hug them or shake a friend's hand. If a neighbor came by offering help, one accidental brush of a handshake would doom them. A swirl of loneliness and fear washed over him, and he hung his head. The morning light sharpened into midday heat, and he felt sweat gathering at his temples. Sweat was at least still sweat. His own body seemed unchanged, which was a small mercy, he supposed. The afternoon brought new attempts. Samantha tried throwing him a piece of fruit with a large leaf still attached, hoping he could catch it by the leaf and pop it into his mouth without touching the fruit itself. He extended his hand gingerly, caught the leaf's stem, and before he could even raise it to his lips, the leaf turned rigid, the fruit's surface gleamed, and everything was lost. He hurled the golden lump away in frustration. It landed with a dull thud. Julie flinched at his outburst, and Samantha swallowed hard, struggling to maintain composure. Each failure chipped away at hope, driving the family into deeper worry. They retreated a safe distance, regrouping behind the barn, whispering urgently. Duke knew they were trying to help him, but he couldn't help feeling a crushing sense of guilt. He had brought this upon himself by uttering that foolish wish. He tried to think of a way out. He remembered TITUS's property, the winding roads he'd taken. He had to return there, confront TITUS, and demand a reversal. But how could he travel even a mile without turning his transportation to gold? He decided to try with the old bicycle stored in the shed, a vehicle simpler than the truck. If metal turned to gold, maybe he could still push it along, right? He ventured behind the barn where Samantha and Julie had scattered a few tools in desperation. The bicycle leaned against a fence post, paint chipped, the seat worn. Before they could stop him, Duke reached out and touched the handlebar. Gold cascaded across its frame like a silent wave. He cursed under his breath, stepping back. A golden bicycle would not function. The chain would be fused, the wheels stuck solid. He was stranded. Samantha came around the corner, careful to keep a healthy distance, maybe 12 feet away. She ran a hand through her hair, looking exhausted. Julie stood behind her, biting her lip. They had to find TITUS. But Samantha didn't know the exact route. She hadn't traveled those back roads. Duke couldn't write directions, he couldn't hold a pen, and any paper would turn to gold. If he drew lines in the dirt, maybe that would help, but even pressing his fingertip to the ground might just turn soil into golden flakes. He hadn't tried that yet. He eyed the earth suspiciously, afraid to make things worse. Still, it was worth a shot. He knelt down, careful not to touch his knees to anything. He hovered his fingertip just above the dirt. If he touched it, would it turn to gold? Or did the curse only affect objects he grasped firmly? Slowly, he lowered his finger until it brushed the surface. Instantly, the soil transformed in a spreading circle of golden sand. He yanked his hand away. The entire patch glittered dully in the sunlight. Samantha gasped, and Julie let out a choked sob. This meant no writing, no diagrams. He was mute in terms of providing directions, unable to guide them. Unless he could use a stick? But the moment he picked up a stick, it would become gold too. Could he push a stick with his shoe? Carve lines in the dirt without touching it directly? Maybe. But he'd have to try carefully, and the results might be unreadable. Every attempt at problem-solving seemed to devolve into failure. As hours bled into late afternoon, Duke grew weaker. He hadn't eaten or drunk anything since yesterday. The dryness in his mouth felt like shards of glass. His stomach knotted in continuous hunger pangs. Samantha tried leaving a bucket of water out in the open, perhaps hoping Duke could find a way to drink without touching it, if he dunked his head in. But what if that touched his face and turned his head into gold? The terror of that possibility made him recoil. He dared not test it. Julie attempted a different approach. She sang softly from the porch, her voice carrying over the still air. Old lullabies she hadn't sung since she was small. Maybe she thought this would calm him, or remind him of simpler times. He closed his eyes and listened, tears threatening to escape. He loved his daughter's voice, and it hurt to know he couldn't step onto that porch and swing her in his arms, tell her it would be all right. Instead, he was stuck down here in the yard, isolated by an invisible wall of magic. Night fell without improvement. Samantha lit a lantern on the porch, its soft glow reaching across the yard. Duke huddled near the barn's entrance, leaning against a beam he'd already turned partially golden. He was so tired. He could barely stand. Hunger gnawed at him. Thirst screamed. He contemplated the future with mounting dread. If they couldn't find a way to feed him without turning the food to gold, he'd starve. If they couldn't find Titus, he'd remain cursed forever. Samantha broke the silence, speaking from a safe distance. "We have to get you help," she said, voice firm. It was the voice she used when making tough decisions. "I'm going to try to find Titus. You said it was a few miles on a dirt road, right?" Duke nodded weakly, remembering his journey. He tried to visualize the route, heading east along the old fence line, past an abandoned silo, turning left at a crooked tree, crossing a shallow creek. Samantha wouldn't know these landmarks. He opened his mouth, wanting to provide directions, but no words came. How could he convey them? Samantha sensed his struggle. She lifted her hands helplessly. "We'll try to find it on our own," she resolved, determination flaring in her eyes. "I'll take the car and retrace your route." Julie looked frightened at the thought of her mother going off alone, but she nodded slowly, as if understanding they had no other choice. Duke rasped, "Be careful." His throat hurt. He had to warn them somehow. He remembered the strange valley where Titus lived. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but there was no choice. Samantha had to try. He could not make this journey himself. His curse would destroy any vehicle he tried to use. That night, Samantha and Julie brought him blankets and tried to toss them so they wouldn't come into direct contact with him before landing. But the blanket caught the wind and brushed his shoulder as it fell. Instantly, the fabric hardened into a heavy golden sheet that thudded to the ground. Julie cried out, rushing forward instinctively, but Samantha grabbed her arm, holding her back. Duke bowed his head, defeated. He would spend the cold night without comfort. They built a small fire a few yards away, its warmth only reaching him faintly. They roasted some potatoes over the flame, their savory scent torturing Duke's senses. He tried not to think about how easily he had eaten such meals before, How casually he had gripped a warm mug of coffee and sipped it. Now he would give anything just to bite into something soft and nourishing. But there was no chance. Even if they threw a potato into his mouth, somehow. What if it turned to gold, the instant his lips brushed its surface? Would he choke on solid metal? In the flickering firelight, Duke looked at his family's silhouettes. Samantha knelt by the flames, her back straight despite exhaustion. Julie sat beside her, hugging her knees, silent tears glistening. He wanted to tell them he would be all right, but he did not trust his words. Still, he managed a whisper. "I love you both." His voice cracked. They answered with choked affirmations, voices trembling. In the silence that followed, Duke's mind drifted to TITUS. That man had known exactly what would happen. He had said the words, "Your wish will be granted come morning." A chill crawled up Duke's spine as he considered the seriousness in Titus's eyes. If Titus had the power to grant such a wish, surely he could reverse it. But what kind of man would bestow a curse without warning? Had this been a test, a lesson, or something else entirely? Samantha would have to make the journey alone, uncertain of the route. If she got lost, could Julie handle things here? Julie was resourceful, but this was beyond anything a teenager should bear. Duke clenched his fists, careful not to touch the ground, feeling utterly useless. He wanted to help, to guide them, to fix this. Instead, he was an anchor dragging his loved ones into the depths of despair. As night deepened, the family fell into a restless quiet. Samantha would have to leave, they decided, to find Titus's homestead. Julie would stay behind to keep an eye on her father, make sure he didn't do anything reckless. They spoke in hushed tones, as if fearful the darkness might carry their plans away. Duke stared at the stars overhead. Usually, he took comfort in those scattered lights, imagining them as silent witnesses to the farm's quiet life. Now he wondered if they looked down in pity or indifference. He couldn't even lie down properly without risking more transformations of the ground beneath him. He leaned back carefully, searching for a neutral surface. The barn's wooden beam, half gold now, would suffice. He pressed just his shoulders against it, not his bare skin, hoping his clothes wouldn't trigger anything. So far, clothing that wasn't directly touched by his hands seemed unaffected, as long as his skin didn't brush it. But he could feel the fear lurking. One wrong move, and even his own shirt might become a rigid golden shell, trapping him inside. He felt dizzy, weak. The lack of nourishment pressed on him like a weight. He thought again of Titus and the creek by that homestead. Maybe something about that place could break the curse. Duke's memory of Titus's voice, calm and measured, returned. "Your wish will be granted, come morning." There had been a finality to it. Perhaps Titus expected Duke to return, begging for mercy. If only he could get there. The hours dragged on. Samantha and Julie rested fitfully, huddled together on the porch, blankets wrapped around them. Duke remained near the barn, watching over them as best he could. He understood now that they were as trapped as he was, their lives orbiting around a crisis no one knew how to solve. Near dawn, the sky began to lighten. Duke could barely stand upright. His legs trembled with weakness. Samantha rose from the porch, her face determined but pale. She would try to find Titus today, though they both knew she might fail. With no map, no directions, just guesswork and the faint memory of Duke's initial journey, it was a desperate gamble. But what choice did they have? Part 5. The Search for Answers. Samantha traced a finger along the creases of an old county map, her eyes narrowing. She remembered how Duke had once mentioned passing a certain old silo on his way to return that strange creature. He must have taken a route that drifted beyond their usual boundaries. In normal times, she would ask Duke directly, and he would mark the path with a pencil. But these were not normal times. They had tried pencils, pens, markers, anything Duke could use to show her where to go. But every object he touched turned into gleaming gold, locked uselessly in its new form. Even the dirt, when pressed too directly by his finger, had stiffened to a gritty gold patch. Yet they needed his guidance. Samantha wouldn't dare attempt to find Titus blindly. Not when Duke's life and their family's future hung on it. Julie noticed her mother's shoulders tense and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Mom," she said softly, "maybe we can find another way for Dad to show you." Her voice sounded older than her years. The crisis had etched new lines of maturity across her face. Samantha turned, studying her daughter's worried eyes, and nodded. If they couldn't do this the easy way, they'd find a harder way. They stepped out onto the porch, the late-day sky flushing pale gold at the edges. Duke stood near the barn, hunched and weary. He had spent the past day trapped in his curse, everything he touched twisting into priceless metal, rendering him helpless. He looked thinner already, his eyes ringed with shadows of hunger and thirst. Julie called out to him, voice carrying across the still air, "Dad, we need your help with directions." Duke turned slowly. He did not approach too closely. He knew better by now. He remained several yards away, on a patch of grass turned patchy with gold flakes from earlier failed attempts. Samantha lifted the map in both hands, waving it so he could see what she held. "We need to find Titus's place," she said, voice steady but urgent. "We have the car. I'll try to retrace your route, but I need some hints. Landmarks." Duke frowned, remembering how the dirt had turned to gold at his touch. He crouched, scanning the ground. He needed a tool he wouldn't have to hold, something he could use indirectly. A few feet away lay a short branch, broken off one of the old apple trees. If he touched it with his bare skin, it would change. But what if he didn't use his hands at all? He crept closer, careful, as if the very air were fragile. Using the toe of his boot, he nudged the branch forward until it was upright in the dirt, then angled his foot carefully to press it downward. He moved slowly, letting the stick's tip scratch a line. The ground itself didn't change if he didn't touch it with his hands or skin. Only objects he directly grasped were cursed. He had discovered this subtlety when he scuffed dirt with his shoe to test it. The transformation required direct touch, flesh to object. His boots were safe, though he dared not test that theory too thoroughly. Samantha and Julie watched as Duke traced a shaky line in the dirt. It was rough, uneven, but after several painstaking minutes, he managed a crude map of the roads as he remembered them. He etched a circle to represent their farm, then drew a line leading east. He made a mark for the abandoned silo, a crooked tree, and a shallow creek crossing. With each landmark, he paused, lifting his foot to let Samantha know to pay attention, and then resumed scratching. He tried to convey an approximate direction. From the silo, head north until you see a low ridge. Turn right at the ridge. Follow the creek. Eventually, you'll find Titus's homestead hidden beyond a small valley. Samantha approached gingerly, kneeling at a safe distance to study the marks in the dirt. She memorized each line, each symbol. Julie hovered behind her mother, eyes darting between the sketch and the real map in her hand, trying to reconcile the two. Though crude, Duke's drawn directions offered hope. Samantha nodded, standing and meeting Duke's eyes. Her gaze said she understood and would do her best. The tension in the air thickened. They all knew what this meant. Samantha would have to leave. She would venture into unfamiliar territory, trusting these improvised instructions. She had never driven these back roads alone. Duke had always taken care of such errands. But she was determined. They had no choice. Samantha tucked the mental map into her mind like a precious heirloom, then turned to Julie. "I'll leave before sunset," she said. "If I leave now, I might find the place by nightfall, or at least I can get close enough to search come morning." Julie swallowed hard. She would have to stay here, take care of her father, or at least keep watch over him. She knew he couldn't be left completely alone, not in his current condition. If something went wrong, if he grew weaker, or tried something desperate, she had to be there. She stepped forward to say goodbye to her mother. Samantha took her daughter's shoulders gently. At least they could still touch each other. Julie's eyes were bright with tears. "Be careful, Mom." Samantha's throat tightened. She nodded, pressing her lips together. "I'll come back, with help," she promised. She took one last look at Duke, whose face was hollow with worry and guilt, and gave him a nod of encouragement. It was all she could offer him now. The sun dipped low as Samantha prepared to set off in their second car, the one Duke had not touched since the curse began. She packed a few supplies: flashlight, water, a blanket, just in case. Julie hovered near the porch, arms wrapped around herself. Duke remained near the barn, giving Samantha space to pull the car out. The engine's rumble sounded strangely loud in the quiet yard. Samantha reversed, then turned down the gravel road. As the car's taillights dwindled, Julie raised a hand in farewell. Duke watched until the dust settled and the silence returned. Night was coming on fast. The sky bruised to a deep indigo, star points emerging timidly. Julie made her way toward her father, stopping several feet short, as always. She lowered herself onto the grass. For a time, neither spoke. The crickets took up their nightly chorus, and a faint breeze carried the scent of hay and distant pines. Julie cleared her throat, her voice trembling at first. "Dad, you okay?" It was a silly question. Of course he wasn't okay. But she needed to break the silence somehow. Duke managed a half smile, though it looked more like a grimace. "Hanging in there," he rasped. His throat felt dry as paper. He was weaker than he'd ever been, hunger and thirst biting at him. He could almost feel their teeth. Yet he forced himself to sound calm for Julie's sake. "You doing all right?" Julie nodded, her ponytail swishing. "I guess. Just worried about everything." She was silent for a beat, then added, "I wish I could help more." Duke's heart twisted. He wished he could cross the distance, rest a comforting hand on her shoulder, tell her she was doing enough. But he dared not move closer. If he stumbled, if he touched her, he would shatter their world. He pressed his lips together, breathed slowly. He had to be strong for her. Julie must have understood what he was feeling, because she tried to make the moment easier. "I could tell you about school?" she offered softly. Before all this happened, she would often spend part of the evening chatting with Duke about her day, complaining about tough tests, laughing over a silly joke a friend told, or asking for advice on a project. He'd always listened, nodding along, providing the occasional word of wisdom. It felt like a lifetime ago. Duke nodded, grateful for the normalcy. He didn't trust his voice not to crack. Julie took a breath and began recounting the little dramas of her high school life. The teacher who gave too much homework, the science fair coming up, the friend who wanted to start a poetry club. She spoke haltingly at first, uncertain if it mattered. But as she continued, describing classmates, silly rumors, and her dream of maybe studying something creative in college, her voice steadied. Perhaps she realized these simple stories kept them both tethered to a world that still spun outside their personal nightmare. Duke listened, soaking in every detail. Her future. He would give anything to ensure she still had one free of this curse's shadow. He remembered how he used to take such conversations for granted. He remembered shrugging off her worries with a smile, comforting her with a pat on the back or a playful tousle of her hair. Now he understood that every touch, every small gesture of affection had been a gift he never truly appreciated, until it was gone. As Julie talked, the stars multiplied overhead. The moon rose, a quiet witness. The farm looked deceptively peaceful, the fields sleeping under starlight, the barn's shadow stretching long, the old fences still holding their perimeter. But within this peace lurked a terrible tension. Samantha was out there, driving lonely roads in search of a man who wielded strange powers. Duke tried not to think of what she might encounter, if she'd find TITUS easily, or wander lost among dark fields. He tried to picture her safe and determined, the car's headlights cutting through dusty lanes, her eyes scanning for landmarks he had etched so clumsily in the dirt. Julie's voice brought him back. She finished a story about a class project and fell silent, staring at him. He could sense her unspoken question. "Are you still with me? Are you still my dad? Underneath all this horror?" "I'm proud of you," Duke managed to say. His voice was rough, but he meant every word. "You're handling this better than I ever could have imagined." He remembered the day she was born, how tiny and fragile she seemed. Now here she was, steadying him just by sharing bits of her life. It made his chest ache. Julie nodded, blinking back tears. "I'm proud of you too, Dad," she whispered, "for holding on." She glanced at the barn, at the places where gold patches marred wood and straw, and shuddered slightly. She knew how impossible his situation was. Still, he hadn't given up. They sat this way for a long time, father and daughter separated by a few feet that felt like a canyon. She drew her knees up, resting her chin on them. He kept his hands close to his sides, as if his own skin was a weapon he must keep sheathed. The world around them breathed softly, the rustle of a distant animal in the brush, the sigh of a faint wind. With each passing minute, Duke felt his strength wane, hunger and thirst nipping at him with sharper fangs. But he would endure. He had to. Eventually, Julie's voice grew quieter, words slower. The night deepened, and the cool air brought a kind of truce to their worries. They spoke in low murmurs about small memories that felt safer than contemplating the future. The time Duke taught Julie how to ride her bike without training wheels. The afternoon they all got caught in a summer storm and ran for the porch laughing. The way Samantha used to hum when she didn't know anyone was listening. Shared recollections piled around them like warm blankets, fending off despair. At some point, Julie dozed off, curled not too far from the barn's entrance. She fought sleep valiantly, but the emotional exhaustion claimed her. Duke watched her from his distance, making sure she was warm enough. He dared not drape a blanket over her. He couldn't handle it, and if he tried with a shoe or something indirect, he might wake her, or worse, slip and risk contact. He scanned the surroundings for something he might do. Finding none, he settled for keeping vigil, his eyes trained on her sleeping form, vowing silently that he would not let anything happen to her. He imagined Samantha at that same moment, driving under moonlight, headlights sweeping across unfamiliar crossroads. Perhaps she spotted the old silo Duke had mentioned, looming like a ghostly monument in the darkness. Maybe she made the right turn at the crooked tree, the one Duke tried to scratch into the dirt. Maybe the creek's gentle murmur guided her forward. He prayed that by dawn she would find Titus and convince him to undo this nightmare. He pictured her kneeling before Titus, explaining their plight, begging him to reverse the curse placed on Duke. He could almost hear her voice, firm, no nonsense, and fueled by desperate love. Time stretched. The moon sailed across the sky. The distant call of an owl echoed, a lonely sound. Duke stood carefully, testing his legs, feeling their tremor. He stepped away from the barn and looked out over the fields. He couldn't go far. Any attempt to leave might endanger Julie if he somehow lost control. He settled instead for pacing slowly, watching his footing so he wouldn't touch anything he shouldn't. Each step reminded him of his weakness, of the things he could never do now, like climb into the truck and race after Samantha to help her, or reach out to brush the hair from Julie's forehead as she slept. These simple acts were the gold he truly craved now, not the metal that cursed his hands. He returned to his spot near the barn and lowered himself carefully to the ground again. The night air smelled of distant blossoms. He thought of the future. If Samantha succeeded, he might be freed. He pictured washing his hands in the creek near Titus's place, imagined feeling cool water run over his skin without turning to gold. He pictured returning home, scooping Julie into a hug that would last an eternity, and holding Samantha's hands as they both breathed sighs of relief. He imagined an ordinary breakfast with coffee and toast that didn't gleam like metal. Such small dreams had once been reality. Now they felt like prayers. Julie stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly. Duke tensed, but she settled quickly. The poor girl was exhausted. He took this as a sign that he must remain strong. If Samantha came back tomorrow with instructions or a solution, he needed to be alive, lucid, able to stand and comply with whatever ritual or condition Titus demanded. If Titus asked for something in return, Duke would give it. He would offer anything to break this curse, to restore his family's world to the gentle, loving place it had been. As the hours tiptoed past midnight, Duke realized he had survived another day. He was bone-weary, starved, thirsty, aching with loneliness and remorse, but still present, still resisting the urge to crumble. For Julie, for Samantha, he would endure. This vigil in the darkness felt like some ancient test of character. He prayed that by morning, Samantha's journey would yield hope. Until then, he kept watch over his sleeping daughter, replaying the sound of her voice in his mind and imagining Samantha's determined face lit by the glow of the car's dashboard as she navigated unknown roads. Somewhere, off in the distance, a fox called. The stars wheeled overhead, patient and silent. Duke listened to the slow rhythm of Julie's breathing and let it guide him through the darkest hours. When dawn came, they would face whatever awaited them. For now, he cradled hope as carefully as he would have cradled Julie's hand, if only he could. Part 6. A Costly Accident. The dusky light settled over the farm like a slow exhale. The horizon was awash in deep purples and blues, and the old barn's silhouette pressed starkly against a sky pricked with the first scattered stars. Inside that hush, Duke crouched on a patch of ground near the barn door, shoulders rigid from another endless day of thirst and hunger. He was too weak to stand easily now, and the mere act of lifting his head felt like wrestling gravity itself. He could sense the evening's chill creeping under his shirt, raising goosebumps on his skin. Julie watched him from several steps away, her eyes anxious and clouded with worry. The hours without Samantha had stretched thin, each minute a fragile strand holding the father and daughter together. Samantha had left in the family's second car to seek TITUS. She had not returned, and night was claiming the fields once more. Julie's mind looped through the same pleas. Please let Mom find him. Please let her come back. Please let Dad hold on. She was running on fumes of hope, and that hope was beginning to flicker. Duke couldn't look at his daughter without shame and sorrow gnawing at his heart. He'd kept himself apart from her for her own safety, but seeing her face, pale with worry, and doing nothing to fix it, made him feel like a failing guard who can't protect his cherished charge. He tried to speak, to reassure her, but his throat was so parched his voice barely emerged. Instead, he lifted a hand slowly, palm outward, a gesture that said, "I see you. I'm still here. I'm sorry for everything." Julie nodded, understanding the unspoken message. She stood on the farmhouse's porch steps now, a small lantern flickering at her feet. She had rummaged through closets and drawers earlier, finding a pair of metal tongs with long handles. She had a desperate idea. If she used the tongs to hold a bottle of water at a safe angle, maybe her father could drink without touching the bottle himself. She knew his curse was absolute. Anything he touched turned to gold. But maybe she could keep the container far enough away that only water passed his lips. It was a risky plan, complicated and perhaps foolish. But what choice did they have? He needed water. He needed something to keep him alive until Samantha returned with help. Julie took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and picked up the tongs. The metal clinked softly, echoing in the quiet yard. "I'm going to try something," she said, voice shaking only a little. The lantern's light caught the worry in her eyes, turning them glossy. Duke saw her lift a bottle of water with the tongs, one of the last plastic bottles they had in the kitchen. He shook his head minutely, silently protesting. He didn't want her putting herself at risk. But Julie's mind was set. She took a tentative step off the porch, then another, closing the gap between them with measured care. The grass whispered beneath her shoes. Night insects had begun their chorus, a background hum that made the world feel older and more secretive. Each step Julie took was slow, deliberate, like approaching a wild animal. Duke's breath grew uneven. He was terrified that a gust of wind, a misstep, or a moment's carelessness might bring them too close. He didn't trust his own reflexes now. He was too tired, too desperate. If he forgot for even an instant, he might reach out to her. The mere thought twisted his stomach. She paused a few yards away, holding the bottle at arm's length with the tongs. The bottle dangled awkwardly, swaying a little. She needed to get it close enough that Duke could tilt his head and sip the water without his hands making contact. She shuffled closer, heart pounding. The lantern's glow waned behind her and darkness wrapped around them like a cloak. "Dad," she called softly, "I'm going to hold it near your face. You just lean forward and drink. Don't touch it. Okay?" Duke nodded. He didn't trust his voice not to crack and startle her. His heart hammered against his ribs. He couldn't remember a time he'd ever felt so frightened, not even when he'd faced down storms or sick livestock had he felt this helpless. His entire body strained against instinct. He wanted to reach up and steady the bottle for himself, but that would spell disaster. He must remain perfectly still, letting her do the delicate work. Julie inched closer, eyes locked on her father's hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. She could see how he trembled from weakness. He looked on the brink of collapsing. She moved another step closer, leaning forward. The bottle's thin plastic crinkled slightly, and she clenched the tongs tighter. She must not drop it. Then fate played its cruel hand. A loose stone or a small dip in the ground caught the toe of her shoe. Julie staggered, losing her balance. She made a tiny yelp of surprise as she pitched forward. The lantern's glow behind her flickered wildly across their silhouettes, painting them in frantic shadows. Duke's reflexes, honed over years of farm work and fatherhood, kicked in. He saw his daughter falling and reached out without thinking. Pure instinct, the old urge to protect his child. His fingertips grazed her arm, just the barest brush of contact. He realized his mistake a fraction of a heartbeat too late. A sickening wave of horror washed through him as he remembered the curse. He tried to yank his hand back, but it was done. Instantly, the magic seized Julie's flesh. Her soft skin, her warm body, hardened to gold in the blink of an eye. The momentum of her fall froze too, leaving her balanced at an impossible angle, golden hair frozen in mid-sway, mouth parted slightly in surprise. The tongs and bottle clattered to the ground, instantly turning into lumps of precious metal. Duke stared, paralyzed. It was as if time stopped. He could not breathe, could not think. He knelt there, arm extended, and where his beloved daughter had once stood, now stood a perfect golden statue, a cruel mockery of life. No breath, no warmth, just cold, gleaming metal. Julie! His voice broke, a desperate whisper that belonged to a wounded animal. He lunged forward, forgetting himself. He wrapped his arms around her statue, pulling her close. She was heavy, unyielding. He sobbed, pressing his face against that lifeless metal. Tears welled and spilled down his cheeks, uselessly sliding across golden shoulders. He whispered her name over and over, as if chanting it might restore her. Agony ripped through him. He wanted to scream, to tear the sky apart with his grief. This was his fault, his wish, his careless joke, had taken everything precious and twisted it into this nightmare. He would have given anything, his farm, his health, his own life, to feel Julie's heartbeat again, to see her eyes blink and fill with confusion. He'd even take her scolding him for being reckless if it meant she could speak. He sank to the ground, cradling the statue's form, tears streaking his dirty face. He tried to weep on her shoulder, but it was no comfort. It was like clinging to a tombstone. He whispered broken promises, begged forgiveness. The insects kept chirping, indifferent. The lantern flickered on the porch. If Samantha returned now, what would she find? The horror of that thought struck him. He had to fix this. But how? Samantha was far from home, driving under a silent moon. She navigated winding roads that grew narrower and rougher with every mile. The car's headlights washed over grass and old wooden fences, illuminating brief flashes of a landscape that felt oddly secretive. She consulted the mental map Duke had drawn with his shoe in the dirt. She had found the crooked tree hours ago, past the old silo that loomed like a ghost on the horizon. Now, she followed a shallow creek, its banks reflecting starlight. The tension in her shoulders was constant. She had no idea what might happen when she found Titus, if she found him at all. The silence pressed on her ears. She had tried turning on the radio earlier, but the static and faint voices made her nervous. Better to keep the world quiet. Her thoughts were too loud anyway. She pictured Duke's face, lined with suffering, and Julie's worried eyes. She pictured the dawn and what it might bring. She had to succeed. Failure was not an option. At last, after cresting a small rise, she spotted a faint glow ahead. The road narrowed to a path of packed earth. Samantha's heartbeat quickened. She slowed the car, headlights sweeping across what appeared to be a run-down homestead. Wooden fencing slumped on one side, a modest cabin with a porch sagging slightly. A thin stream of water trickled through the yard, catching faint moonlight. Samantha recognized the place from Duke's description and his desperate directions. This must be Titus's home. She parked a good distance away, not wanting to startle anyone. She cut the engine, and the sudden silence felt like a vacuum. She got out, the night air cool against her face. The creek's gentle burble was the only sound. Samantha hesitated at the gate, if it could be called that, since one hinge was broken. She stepped through, her footsteps careful. She could feel eyes on her, though she saw no one at first. Back on the farm, Duke rocked gently, cradling Julie's golden form in his arms. He sobbed until his chest ached. When at last he looked up, tears still blurring his vision, he forced himself to think. He had to hold on. Samantha would return with a solution. He had to believe that. But how many hours would it take? Would Julie remain trapped in metal forever if they didn't act soon? His body shook with grief and hunger. He wanted to curl up on the ground and never move again. Yet he forced himself to lay Julie's statue gently on the grass. The metal figure caught the moonlight, gleaming heartbreakingly bright. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, careful not to touch anything else. He had to protect her, even now, keep watch until Samantha came back, maybe with Titus in tow, maybe with some magic water or a ritual to break this curse. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice ragged. The night answered with silence. The lantern on the porch guttered, its flame shrinking. He would have to wait in the dark, alone, watchful, clinging to the hope that Samantha would succeed. On the farm, time seemed to stand still. Duke knelt beside Julie's statue, head bowed, whispering apologies and endearments. He remembered teaching her to fish, guiding her hands on the rod. He recalled her laughter echoing across the fields when they chased each other in summer twilight. He promised her a future with all the love and care he could offer. Now all he saw was gleaming gold, as if the curse had taken not just her flesh but her very soul. He refused to believe that. He had to believe she was still in there somehow, waiting to be freed. The wind picked up, rustling the fields. A distant coyote yipped, its cry oddly forlorn. Duke swallowed hard, throat aching, no tears left to shed. He forced himself to breathe, focusing on that simple act. Samantha would return. She had to. If anyone could persuade Titus, it was her. She was fearless when it came to protecting their family. Duke pressed his forehead against Julie's golden cheek, whispering, hold on," as if she could hear him. He imagined Samantha speeding through the night, returning with salvation. He prayed that Julie would come alive, her eyes would open, and her heart would beat again. He would never again wish for anything beyond what he already had. He now knew that no amount of gold could match the warmth of a living hand in his own. In that fateful night, the three members of this torn family were scattered like pieces of a shattered glass. Samantha standing at the threshold of a miracle, Duke cradling a golden daughter in unimaginable grief, and Julie trapped in silent stasis, awaiting the touch of a healing stream. The moon bore witness, and the fields whispered their quiet sympathies. Everything hinged on what would happen next. For now, Duke pressed his lips to Julie's unyielding forehead and prayed that mercy might prevail. He would give up all the gold in the world, every last ounce of it, for one more moment of her laughter. He would wait in the darkness, nourished only by hope. Part 7. Bargaining with Titus. Samantha stood before Titus's small cabin, the night wind tugging at her hair, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The journey here had pushed her beyond exhaustion. She had navigated by starlight and memory, forcing herself to remain calm despite the panic slithering through her veins. Now she was here, eyes wide and desperate, fists clenched at her sides. She took a shaky breath and knocked hard on the warped wooden door, not caring that it was well past midnight, not caring what kind of man Titus might be. All that mattered was saving her family. At first, there was only silence. The night pressed close, and the small creek that wound through Titus's yard whispered softly, as if urging patience. Samantha refused to be patient. She raised her fist to knock again when the door swung inward. revealing Titus's large form silhouetted by lamplight. He studied her in silence, his face grave, as though he had expected this visit. Samantha wasted no time. Her voice came out in a tight rush, words stumbling over one another, fueled by terror and love. "It's my husband, Duke. The wish you granted him." She paused, swallowing hard. "You have to lift it. He can't eat or drink. Everything he touches turns to gold. He's starving. He's thirsty. He can't come near us." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she felt hot tears threatening to spill. She had sworn to keep calm, to negotiate logically, but how could any mother remain composed when her husband was lost in such a horrific way? Titus listened quietly, his large frame blocking the doorway, arms folded over his chest. The lantern light inside revealed lines etched deep around his eyes, lines of old sorrow and understanding. He did not look surprised. If anything, he seemed resigned, as though he had long known such a plea would come eventually. Samantha's nails bit into her palms. "Please," she said, voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "I'm begging you. We never meant for this to happen. Duke didn't understand what he was asking. He was just returning your pet. He's a good man." Her voice took on a fierce edge. "You know he didn't deserve this." Titus let out a slow breath. He stepped back from the door, gesturing for her to enter. Samantha hesitated. She had never been inside this cabin. She had never even seen Titus before today. But there was no time for caution. She stepped in, finding herself in a cramped, low-ceilinged room lit by a single oil lamp on a wooden table. The air smelled faintly of pine and old wool blankets. The creature Duke had rescued, Winna, he'd called it, was curled up in a corner, watching Samantha with curious, unblinking eyes. Titus closed the door behind them, the latch clicking softly. He said nothing for a moment, and Samantha fidgeted under his silent scrutiny. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I knew there would be consequences to granting such a wish. Your husband asked for his touch to turn all it touched to gold. I honored his words. I did not twist them nor deceive him. He asked, and I provided." Anger flared in Samantha's chest. "You knew this would happen, and you let it." Her voice rang out sharply in the small space. The creature in the corner lifted its head. Samantha's fists tightened. "You could have warned him." Titus nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her fury. He did not heed my earlier invitation to name a different wish. He laughed it off. Sometimes a lesson must unfold naturally. Magic follows its own laws, and interference at the start can do more harm than good. His gaze met hers, and Samantha saw regret there, but also a certain calm acceptance. "I'm not here to punish you, Samantha, nor your husband, but these are old forces at work, and such gifts always come with a price." She trembled, wanting to hurl insults, to shout that he had no right, but time was precious, and her family's safety mattered more than trading blame. She took a breath, tried to steady her voice. "Then help me fix this," she said, each word carefully measured. "Tell me how to save them. I'm willing to pay whatever price is needed." Titus studied her face, his eyes flicking over her weary features, her cracked lips, her rumpled clothes. "Very well," he said at last. He turned to a wooden chest in the corner, old and bound with iron hinges. Opening it, he retrieved a simple wooden bucket. It looked unremarkable, just weathered slats bound by metal hoops. He set it on the table with a careful thump. Samantha waited, heart pounding. Her gaze darted from the bucket to Titus's grim face. "What is it?" she asked softly. Titus ran a hand along the bucket's rim. "This bucket," he said, "is made from wood that grew near the creek outside. The creek's waters carry a special property. Call it magic. Call it a blessing. The same force that allowed me to grant your husband's wish flows through that water." Samantha frowned, trying to piece it together. "So I need to use that water." "Yes," Titus said. "Fill this bucket from the creek. Pour the water over anything turned to gold, and you will restore them. As for Duke—" He paused, eyes distant. "To break the curse entirely, he must bathe in the creek's waters. Not just a splash. He must immerse himself. Only then will his touch revert to what it once was. Mortal. Warm. Harmless. Samantha nearly sagged in relief, but a coil of tension still gripped her. "That's it?" she asked. It seemed too simple, too direct. After all this horror, the solution was a bucket of water and a bath in the creek? Titus inclined his head. "The path is simple, but not without risk. You must hurry. Duke, he's weak, isn't he? You said he can't eat or drink." He pursed his lips. "Be quick. Time is not your ally." Samantha's throat tightened. "I'll hurry," she said, voice firm as steel. Without waiting for further explanation, she reached for the bucket. Titus's hand shot out, gripping her wrist, not cruelly, but firmly. She froze. His eyes held hers with an intensity that demanded her attention. "Samantha," he said quietly, "I offer this solution freely, but understand me. The water's power is not infinite. It will restore what has been lost, but should this curse be taken lightly again? Should anyone repeat such a reckless wish?" He broke off, letting silence complete the warning. Then he released her wrist. Samantha nodded, heart fluttering. "I understand. Believe me, we never wanted this." She carefully took the bucket, holding it close as though it were precious cargo. "Thank you," she said softly. Her eyes were damp. She never thought she'd be thanking the man who had caused this nightmare, but here she was, desperate and humble. Titus did not smile, but something in his stance eased. "Go now," he said. "The creek is just outside. Fill the bucket, return home, and do as I've said." Samantha turned, heading for the door. The creature, Winna, watched her pass, its eyes dark and fathomless. As she reached the threshold, Titus's voice called after her, quieter now. "When this is done, remember what it cost. Treasure what you have." She hesitated, one hand on the latch, then nodded and stepped out into the night. The door closed behind her with a soft thud. Outside, the moon still reigned over fields and hills, casting pale light on the creek's shimmering surface. Samantha hurried down the slope, half sliding, half running. She knelt by the creek's edge, her lungs tight with urgency. The water gurgled softly, reflecting star-spangles. She dipped the bucket in, filling it to the brim. A hush fell, as if the world held its breath. She stared at the water inside, clear, ordinary-looking, yet brimming with hope and miracles. She scrambled back up to her car, careful not to spill a drop. Opening the trunk, she steadied the bucket with blankets so it wouldn't tip on the drive home. She slammed the trunk shut and hurried to the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. Glancing over her shoulder at Titus's property, she saw no one. Perhaps he had already retreated inside. No matter. She had what she needed. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as she sped away. Samantha pressed the accelerator, knuckles white on the wheel. She whispered frantic prayers into the silent cabin of the car. Every moment that passed was another moment that Duke starved in misery. She remembered Duke's face when she left, hollow-eyed, desperate. Her foot pressed harder on the accelerator. She must reach them in time. The roads were dark, unfamiliar, but she followed the route back by intuition and starlight. She recognized the crooked tree, the abandoned silo looming in the moonlight, the rough bend of the creek she had followed out here. Though weary, her heart pounded with adrenaline. She would not stop, not even to catch her breath. Hours seemed to stretch elastically in the darkness. She tried not to think about what might await her at the farm. What if Duke had given up? What if he'd... No, she couldn't afford such thoughts. She forced them down, focusing on the present. She had the cure. She would save them. Eventually, she saw the distant glow of her farmhouse lights. Relief mingled with fear. She slowed only when the familiar outlines of the barn and fields emerged from night's embrace. Part 8. Restoration and Renewal. A pale ribbon of light crept along the eastern horizon as Samantha pulled into the familiar gravel driveway of their farm, heart pounding, the bucket of creek water sloshing at her feet. The entire journey back, She had driven with white-knuckled resolve, refusing to let fatigue or fear slow her. Each passing minute was another that Duke and Julie suffered. Although she had spoken with Titus and learned the method to undo this terrible curse, the knowledge alone wouldn't help if she arrived too late. She jumped out of the car before the engine fully sputtered off, the chill of pre-dawn air sharp in her lungs. Across the yard, near the old barn, she saw Duke's silhouette hunched low over something gleaming in the starlight. Her breath caught. Julie. Samantha gripped the bucket's handle until it dug into her palm and hurried forward, her boots kicking up small bursts of dust and dead grass. "Duke," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. He was still as a statue himself, leaning over their daughter's golden figure. As Samantha drew nearer, she saw how rigidly he held himself, how thin and haggard he'd become since she left. His clothes hung on him, his cheeks were hollow. The torment of hunger, thirst, and guilt had carved lines into his face she'd never seen before. When her voice reached him, Duke turned, eyes shadowed but alive with a flicker of hope. He couldn't speak right away. His throat seemed too dry for words. Instead, he looked at the bucket in Samantha's hand, at the trembling resolve in her eyes. And he understood. She had found the way. She had come back for them. "I have the water," Samantha said, voice shaking. She knelt beside Julie's rigid form. The lamplight from the porch barely touched them out here, but the faint starlight and the impending dawn glinted off the golden statue. Julie's eyes were closed, her posture forever frozen in that last moment of shock and fear. Samantha's heart nearly failed her at the sight. Her hands trembled so hard she could barely steady the tin cup she had brought along to scoop and pour the water. Duke hovered, desperate but careful. He dared not touch Samantha or Julie. He still carried the curse in his fingertips. He could only watch. Samantha dipped the cup into the bucket, the creek water catching a faint silvery sheen. She held her breath, extending the cup over Julie's golden cheek, remembering Titus's quiet instructions. "Pour it over anyone turned to gold," he had said, "and they will return to flesh and blood." Even so, her heart hammered with doubt. What if it didn't work? What if Titus's magic failed? She tilted the cup. Water cascaded softly, gleaming as it fell, and struck the golden surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The droplets clung there, reflecting the dawn. Samantha's pulse thundered. Then, slowly, impossibly, the gold began to dim and soften, as if it were wax melting under gentle heat. Julie's rigid features relaxed, color bled into her cheeks. Her chest rose in a sudden gasp, and she coughed, eyes flying open, drawing sweet air into lungs imprisoned moments before. Samantha choked on a sob of relief. She set the cup aside and grasped Julie's shoulders, pulling her upright. Julie sagged against her mother, shivering, confused. Duke cried out hoarsely, stepping forward instinctively. Then, remembered the curse and halted, his body shaking with longing. He couldn't hold his daughter yet. Not until he was free of this nightmare. "Mom?" Julie's voice was scratchy, thin. She blinked, disoriented by starlight and the strange tension etched into her parents' faces. Samantha wept, smoothing Julie's hair, pressing her forehead against the girl's. Julie was alive. Flesh and blood. The farm's silence bore witness to their reunion. "It's all right," Samantha whispered. "You're safe now. I have you." She cradled her daughter as if Julie were a toddler again, kissing her temple, tears soaking into Julie's hair. When Samantha glanced back at Duke, her eyes met his. He nodded slowly, gratitude and anguish mingling. This was half the battle won. Now for the other half. Julie coughed, taking in her surroundings. She remembered falling, the tongs, the water bottle, and then nothing. Terror flickered across her face as she pieced it together. Samantha hushed her gently, promising explanations later. For now, they must save Duke. "Duke," Samantha said, voice resolute now. "Titus said you must bathe in his creek to lift the curse." She looked him over, too weak, trembling. He had survived on nothing for too long. He needed real water and food soon. But first, They had to end the magic that threatened everyone he loved. Duke looked down at his hands, still fearful of his own touch. He nodded. He would have walked barefoot on hot coals if that's what it took. Samantha eased Julie onto a patch of grass and stood, retrieving the bucket. She motioned Duke toward the car. "I'll drive. We're going back." He frowned, uncertain. The first time he had touched their truck, it turned to gold, but Samantha had taken the other car and protected it from his touch. They would have to be careful. "Use something to shield my hands," he rasped, each word painful. Samantha understood instantly. She hurried to the barn, grabbed an old horse blanket, and wrapped it around the passenger seat and the dashboard. She opened the car door, instructing Duke to enter, without touching anything with bare skin. He obeyed, awkwardly maneuvering so that nothing but the soles of his boots grazed the floor mat. Samantha fastened his seatbelt herself, careful not to let his hands wander. Julie watched from a safe distance, still trembling but determined. "I'll stay," she offered, not wanting to complicate the trip. Samantha hesitated. Julie was still shaken, but bringing her along posed risks. In the end, Samantha decided Julie should come too. She couldn't leave her daughter alone here, not after everything. Together, they managed to settle Julie in the back seat, well out of Duke's reach. Samantha placed the bucket in the trunk with utmost care. They might need more of that water yet. The sky deepened into pale purple as Samantha steered the car away from the farm, heading back through the winding roads, guided now by memory rather than desperation. Dawn hovered, and in that uncertain light, the fields took on a ghostly hue. Duke leaned his head back against the seat, wincing at every bump in the road, his body screaming for rest. Julie gazed silently out the window, one hand pressed to her heart, as if unsure if it still beat normally. Samantha gripped the wheel, knuckles pale, pushing the car as fast as she dared without risking an accident on these rough back roads. They passed the landmarks Duke had etched in memory, and Samantha had retraced with such urgency: the abandoned silo, the crooked tree bending over the path, the creek's trickling murmur guiding them. As dawn's first true light reached across the fields, they caught sight of TITUS's homestead again. It looked no different than before: a ragged fence, a slanting cabin, the thin stream of water glowing faintly in the morning hush. Samantha parked, heart pounding. She glanced at Duke. He swallowed hard, sweat beading on his brow. "This is it," he said, voice like gravel. Julie leaned forward in her seat, curiosity mingling with fear. Samantha got out first, opened Duke's door, and helped him step free. He wobbled, and she put a hand on his elbow to steady him, careful to avoid his bare skin. Julie hovered just behind. TITUS emerged from behind his cabin, hands folded. He did not look surprised to see them return. A quiet understanding passed between him and Samantha, and she nodded. No words were needed. She guided Duke toward the creek. The water's gentle murmur was the only sound, save for Duke's ragged breathing. "Go in," Samantha said softly, voice catching. Duke hesitated only a moment. He kicked off his boots. Shoes had proved harmless so far, but better not to risk contaminating the water if he slipped, and stepped into the creek. The water was shockingly cold, biting into his skin, but he pressed forward until he was waist-deep, then chest-deep. His eyes drifted closed. Julie clasped her mother's hand, trembling. They watched Duke take one last breath and dunk himself fully beneath the surface. The water rippled, moonstones of early sunlight dancing over its surface. When Duke rose, water streaming down his hair and face, he gasped, lungs filling with fresh morning air. He looked at his hands, turning them slowly as if seeing them for the first time. Samantha and Julie stood at the bank, eyes wide with anticipation. He reached out, touching a blade of grass at the creek's edge. It remained a blade of grass. He stooped, picked up a small stone, and held it, heart thumping, still a stone, ordinary and rough. Relief flooded him so powerfully he nearly collapsed, tears mixing with creek water on his cheeks. He stumbled toward the bank, arms outstretched. Samantha rushed into the shallows, meeting him halfway, and this time she did not flinch. His hand gripped hers, warm and calloused, achingly human. She sobbed openly. Julie splashed in too, not caring if her shoes got soaked, wrapping both arms around her father's waist. Duke pulled them both close, as if afraid to let go again, tears leaking down his face in silent streams. They stood there for a long moment, all three entwined, water swirling around their ankles. Titus watched from a distance, his face unreadable. Perhaps he smiled faintly. Perhaps he simply observed the tapestry of fate he had helped weave, and now helped unweave. Eventually, Samantha led them back to dry ground. Duke shivered in his damp clothes, and Julie pressed close, offering warmth. Samantha took Duke's face in her hands, real, flesh and blood hands, and kissed his forehead. "We're free," she whispered. He nodded, voice lost. He ran a hand through Julie's hair, marveling at its softness, at the simple miracle of touching his daughter without harm. "Thank you," Samantha called quietly toward Titus, who inclined his head solemnly. There were no more bargains to be struck, no more words needed. They understood each other now. The family turned, guiding Duke toward the car. Titus did not follow. Winna, the strange creature, peered from behind the cabin's corner, watching them depart. Perhaps Titus knew they would remember this lesson forever. The drive home was calmer, the sun rising fully behind them, painting the Wyoming fields in gentle yellows and greens. Duke, exhausted, leaned against the seat, holding Samantha's hand with one of his and Julie's with the other. They had carefully arranged themselves so they could all touch now, no barriers needed. Julie dozed on Duke's shoulder, her breathing steady and peaceful. Upon arriving at the farm, it looked different under this new light, familiar yet infinitely precious. The old barn's red paint glowed softly. The fields swayed in a mild breeze. They emerged from the car and walked inside the farmhouse, leaving muddy footprints and not caring. Samantha immediately fetched a pitcher of water. Duke's eyes shone at the sight of it. He picked up a simple wooden cup. No transformation followed. He drank greedily, tears escaping down his cheeks, tasting nothing but ordinary, blessed water. Julie rummaged in the kitchen, producing bread that was a day old but still good enough, and some butter. The three of them sat around the kitchen table. Duke lifted a piece of bread to his mouth and bit into it. It did not change into metal or vanish into horror. It remained bread. Simple, honest bread. He closed his eyes, savoring the flavor and the texture as if it were the greatest feast on earth. Samantha poured each of them a glass of water, and they raised their cups silently, as if toasting to life itself. Their eyes met over the tabletop. No words needed. Each understood how close they had come to losing what mattered most. Julie nibbled her bread, then leaned her head against Duke's arm, warm and safe. Samantha wiped her tears, smiling through a trembling laugh. They had survived something unimaginable, and come through it more grateful than ever. After they finished, Samantha began tidying. Julie offered to help, and Duke joined in, carefully rinsing his cup, marveling at the sensation of warm water against his hands that changed nothing but cleaned away crumbs and dust. They spent the morning tending to small chores, re-entering the rhythm of farm life, feeding chickens, checking on the fields, making sure the barn door latched properly. The animals greeted them as always, unaware of the family's ordeal. Yet somehow the familiar chores felt like benedictions, each one a reminder that normal life was a gift. By mid-morning, the sun bathed their home in gentle warmth. Duke, Samantha, and Julie stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden railing, looking out over the fields. The old pickup truck, once threatened to become a golden prison, now sat as it always had. Scuffed paint, squeaky brakes, a reminder of honest work and honest rewards. Nothing gleamed with unnatural luster now. Everything breathed, changed, grew, as nature intended. Duke slipped an arm around Samantha's waist and reached his other hand for Julie's. They stood together in silence, feeling the wind brush their cheeks. Eventually, Julie sighed softly. "I never knew how precious everything was," she said, voice full of wonder. Just eating bread, or touching someone's hand. Samantha nodded, eyes full of tears she didn't bother to hide. "We'll never forget," she said. "We have each other. That's all that matters." Duke said nothing, just held them close. His throat was too tight for words. He understood now that wealth meant nothing compared to the comfort of a loved one's embrace, that no treasure could surpass the taste of real food when you're hungry, or the cool drink of water when you're thirsty. He had learned the hardest way that magic wishes could bring unimaginable suffering. He vowed silently never to take a simple day for granted again. Afternoon shadows stretched lazily, and in time, they returned to their daily tasks. Julie would go to school tomorrow, telling no one of her strange adventure. Samantha would keep the memory of Titus's Creek close to her heart. A quiet secret. Duke would walk the fields, tend the animals, knowing that his hands were now safe, his touch mortal and kind. Days would pass, seasons would roll by, and life would unfold as it always had, peaceful and challenging in equal measure. But they would carry forward with a deeper understanding, cherishing the smallest moments, the crunch of fresh-picked vegetables, the laughter shared under a starry sky, the warmth of a hug at day's end. As the sun reached its zenith, lighting the Wyoming fields with a gentle radiance, the Haynes family carried on. No gold-plated monuments adorned their land, no cursed treasures hid in the shadows. Instead, they had love, resilience, and a renewed appreciation for the world as it was, perfect in its imperfection, precious beyond measure. The end.